Hello and welcome everybody. Wave if you can hear me. Just want to make sure we're on track. Looks like you are. Good, excellent. My name is Joel Ringma. I'm hosting on behalf of One Life, and we're glad that you've joined us. I'm excited to welcome, in particular, Reverend Jonathan Nicolai DeKoning, Director of the Micah Centre at the King's University, and we look forward to his talk on pandemic, poverty, and prophetic justice. First, as usual, a few housekeeping details about our Zoom gathering. Most of us have kind of absorbed Zoom into our daily lives the past 14 months. Some of us are still getting used to the technology, but thanks for staying muted. We'll have a chance to share some questions later on. Really good to see all of you on video, and obviously if you're able to keep your video going, we love to see you. We also understand that some circumstances don't really allow you to run your video, but it's a bit of a value to be able to see and interact with faces on the screen as well. So thank you for doing that. And just you should know as well that this lecture is being recorded and it'll be made available for future reference later, and so that's available to you, but you should also know that your face might be recorded on that as well. Some of you might know that I myself am a King's graduate and currently serve on the Board of Governors. And this is related, so bear with me for a moment here. My kids recently were going through an old box of high school report cards. And that's dangerous in and of itself, because I see both Wilma and Dennis on here, and those are two of my high school teachers. But anyways, they came across some very compromising material, including my exam mark from my grade 11 Bible class, which neither Dennis nor Wilma taught. And the exam mark was 48% on my final exam for Bible 11. And so one of my children asked me, you know, how can you, Dad, how can you get 48% on a Bible exam and have any credibility whatsoever as a pastor? And well, I'll let you wonder which of my children that may have been. But so just as an aside, as some sage advice, maybe don't let your kids see your grade 11 report card. But this got me to thinking a little bit, you know, when I was a teacher, my principal once jokingly said, kind of seeing the buzz of eager learners at a teachers convention, he said, education may just be wasted on the youth. And these lectures that you've been joining, that you're joining here maybe for the first time, I think have really had a wide variety of the church participating, and we're thankful for that, from academics to people like me who got 48% on our grade 11 Bible exam, and pretty much everybody in between. And all that to say, lifelong learning isn't just kind of this idea. And so we really value your participation. We're glad that you're here. This is to serve the church, and so we're thankful. And so just looking around, some familiar faces again. Some of you are here for the first time, and so we especially want to welcome you. Sometimes they say in 12-step meetings, the newcomer is the most important person in the room. But I also see a lot of familiar faces, and some of you have participated maybe even in all 5 of these events in this lecture series, and we're grateful that each of you are joining us as well. I wonder if you could just briefly in the chat let us know if this is your first One Life lecture. Maybe just indicate that. If this is, you know, if you got to do some math to figure out if it's your second, third, fourth, or fifth, just guess. But just let us know which lecture this is, which one you're attending, how many of you attended, how many of these you've attended. Just write that right into the chat. And you don't get extra credit for participating in all of them, but you know, we're happy to have you joining us, and so especially welcome to anybody who's here for their first time, as I mentioned earlier. Just reading through the comments, a lot of 5 out of 5, some third, a first timer. Just wonderful to see all participating. And this is related to some of the work that we're going to be doing in a little bit. So it's good to see new, and it's good to see repeat customers. At the very outset of this series, One Life wanted to encourage participation, and so kind of dangled as a bit of a carrot a King's Weekend. That is, that Kings would come to you, that President Melanie and a faculty member and Kathleen Bush would come and make an event, a weekend of it, and the churches participating at a high level would maybe be considered for this, and And so what we're asking is, if you would like Kings to come to you, come to your church, one of the things that you could do is suggest maybe a hot topic as to why Kings should come your way, what the lecture that you might want to hear from a faculty member might be. And later on, towards the end of our time together, there's going to be this feedback form where we'll invite you, you can make suggestions, kind of make your case as to why your church should be awarded this. And then the One Life team will look at that, your reasons, and then your church's participation, and they'll make kind of an estimation as to who deserves this. They're going to kind of judge who deserves to have a team come their way, and then we'll connect you with the King's University to make that a reality. I mean, all that to say, we're just really grateful for your participation, and thankful that we can be here together. This is, as I've reiterating, the 5th in this series of this inaugural lecture series. And I want to point that out because maybe it's been missed, that these lectures are a launch. They are a premiere for One Life. And it's been a very good introduction. And while One Life certainly hopes that you appreciate the lectures, One Life is more than just kind of lecture sponsorship. It's not just a one-trick pony. One Life is this resource for BC Christian Reformed churches on the journey towards becoming wholehearted and vibrant communities of Christian worship and discipleship and mission. And really, One Life longs to help people grow towards one life in Christ. And so, in addition, we're really grateful to have been able to, as One Life, piggyback on the strong shoulders of the King's University for this, and super grateful. And we'll hear a little bit from King's in a few moments. And the way that One Life has kind of structured the work that it does is under the umbrella of our denomination's 5 callings. And so we've heard from gospel proclamation and worship to faith formation, servant leadership, to global mission, and then of course tonight on mercy and justice. And really, we hope that the launch of One Life has helped kind of earn some trust, and that maybe it will be a helpful resource even moving forward that you think about. And hopefully the format has instilled some trust in you as well in One Life. And to that end, I've really appreciated myself kind of how One Life, the lectures have been framed by the One Life team. And so I'm going to turn things over to the One Life team as they kind of, again tonight, kind of frame our gathering, our presence before God. And so I'm just going to turn things over to the One Life team now.
Hello, my name is Rachel Ruge, and I'm the Justice and Mercy Curator, and we'll begin our evening together with the invitation to land acknowledgement. As we gather in this virtual space, we pause to remember that we are not virtual and our Creator God is not virtual. We pause to remember that God was incarnated in Jesus because we are incarnated beings. We are connected with one another through the winds that bring air into our lungs and through the waters that move deep into the earth and up into the sky. We pause to acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet, wherever we are sitting tonight, is historically the home of Indigenous peoples, many of whom have been forced to leave for other lands. And so we share now the names of the peoples who were first to live, celebrate, lament, and sing upon the land where each of us now sit. So I invite you to write in the chat the tribal names of the area where you live. So I would like to acknowledge that my home here on Promontory in Chilliwack is on unceded Stolo Nation territory and is the ancestral home and spiritual realm of the Chechen people. And may we also remember that Indigenous peoples are not a people of the past, but are here with us now. If there are Indigenous people on this call, we invite you now to share your tribe so that we may recognize you. Acknowledging these connections and rooted in these places as a diverse gathering of God's people, we move now into our time of learning and fellowship. So please join us in our opening words and prayers. We invite you to speak the words in bold, but remain muted. And so we say together that our world belongs to God, the earth and all its people. How good it is, how wonderful to live together in unity. Love and faith come together, justice and peace join hands. With the worldwide church, we affirm that
we are made in God's image,
befriended by Christ,
empowered by the Spirit. With the whole church, we affirm that
God's goodness is planted more deeply than all that is wrong.
and with all creation, we celebrate
the miracle and wonder of life,
the unfolding purposes of God forever at work in the world.
In all our gathering, learning, and growing, we wish to remember and embody that
all are welcome at the table of God.
for Christ brings peace to all.
Down every hostile wall.
So that the many may become one.
one family, one heart.
One new humanity.
one life in Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for framing our time with that One Life team. I want to take a moment. Today's lecture, as I mentioned earlier, is under the calling of mercy and justice. That calling, which Rachel Ruge curates. And Rachel, I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about the mercy and justice calling, and just kind of why you're passionate about it.
Yes, I would love to. I'm very passionate about justice and mercy ministry. I'm also a King's alumni. I graduated in 2001 with a Bachelor of Music degree in flute and piano performance. And I'll never forget, in my first semester at King's, I was invited to be part of a worship team that was backup for John Bell. And John Bell is from the Iona community and is a world-renowned worship and justice leader. And being part of this music team was a transformational weekend for me. Over the years, John Bell's music really shaped my sense of calling as a musician and a Christian committed to justice and mercy. And so I would love to have the opportunity now to just read some lyrics from John Bell from that weekend, my first semester at King's, that may explain why I'm here today, 20 years later, the Justice and Mercy Curator for One Life. The song is called Inspired by Love and Anger. Inspired by love and anger, disturbed by need and pain, informed of God's own bias, we ask him once again, how long must some folk suffer, and how long can few folk mind? How long dare vain self-interest turn prayer and pity blind? From those forever victims of heartless human greed, their cruel plight composes a litany of need. Where are the fruits of justice? Where are the signs of peace? When is the day when prisoners in dreams find their release? From those forever shackled to what their wealth can buy, the fear of lost advantage provokes the bitter cry. Don't query our position, don't criticize our wealth, don't mention those exploited by politics and stealth. And then going on into another verse, God asks, who will go for me? And who will extend my reach? And who, when few will listen, will prophesy and preach? And who, when few bid welcome, will offer all they know? and who, when few dare follow, will walk the road I show. John Bell pulls no punches, just as the prophets, Amos, Micah, Jeremiah, also pulled no punches. And so I feel that my education at King's taught me that Black lives matter, that Asian and LGBT lives matter, that creation matters, that children in foster care matter, that refugees matter, that homeless and addicted matter, because God so loved the world, he gave his one and only son. And so here I am, as I mentioned, 20 years later, after graduating from King's, a One Life Justice and Mercy Curator. I also have been working the past 7 years for Diaconal Ministries Canada, which is a partner agency of the CRC, as the Western Canada Regional Ministry Developer. And I feel in part, this is because King's poured gasoline on a flame God had placed in the heart of a 17, 18-year-old classical musician.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That's really helpful, first of all, to get us to know a little bit about you. And I think it's a great segue into why we're eager to hear from Jonathan in a few moments as well. And so thank you so much for that. Just kind of to frame things kind of moving forward for everybody, so you know kind of what you're facing over the next number of minutes. So we're gonna hear a bit in just a moment from President Melanie Humphreys. She's gonna just share a little bit about the vision of King's and its mission. She's going to introduce our speaker as well. And then Reverend Jonathan Nicolai DeKoning is going to be sharing for about 45 minutes. And there's going to be a time after that of questions, interaction, and some closing exercises after that. And so I just want to kind of turn our attention to Pres Mel. So Melanie, I'm just kind of thinking about the partnership that we've had over these last months between One Life and the King's University. I'm grateful that you've attended each of these lectures and introduced each of these speakers. I think that says something in and of itself about your commitment to this. But I'm asking, just before you introduce Jonathan, I'm hoping that Melanie, you can talk about this partnership between King's and One Life. How does One Life and King's kind of fit together in terms of their partnership? And then I guess in some ways, because Jonathan heads up the Micah Centre, how maybe the Micah Centre is a bit emblematic of King's mission and vision. So Melanie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Joel. First, I want to say thank you, Rachel. That was so encouraging. And it's wonderful to hear about how King's has impacted your life and still continues to today. So that's a big encouragement to me. Because truly, this is what we would hope from any graduate. We would hope that there would be some things that were lit, or at least nurtured, or set fire within people's lives, and that would fill and continue to fill their lives with things to think about, develop, and grow more. The King's University, as many of you know, exists to provide university education that it inspires and equips learners to bring renewal and reconciliation to every walk of life as followers of Jesus Christ, the servant King. So that's a mouthful, but it's an important thing. First, I really see our partnership with the One Life. It really grew out of relationship, which is really how I think the best partnerships happen, but it grew out of relationship where King's had visited a church, and we started these conversations, and we saw an opportunity to engage together in conversations about things that really matter, things that people wanted to engage with, and with the One Life 5 callings. So I really see the opportunity for King's to be involved as a service to churches. It's a way of giving. We have a lot of faculty who have studied and thought about topics, and to be able to share that resource is something that we gladly do, and is something that is really, I think, a part of our mission. I think of this also in we do that in a spirit of humility, because the church is not a university, and the university is not a church. And sometimes, like in the CRC tradition, you can talk about sphere sovereignty, for example. But it's the idea that we have this common mission in Christ, so we have things to offer each other, and not to tell the church what to believe, but to engage well in thinking about these things, and to provide that resource, to provide that opportunity for dialogue and engagement, and really for growth. So that would be the second piece. And then the third is a very pragmatic piece, I would say. Just as Rachel is serving the church from some of the things that she had learned at King's, we hope to be providing people that will serve in your congregations, will serve in the CRC church. So pragmatically, send us your youth, send us your people, like very pragmatically. If there's somebody who's looking for a university education, we would hope that you would send them our way, because quite frankly, I can tell you this from experience, every institution, every university has a worldview, whether they own it or not. Secular, Christian, whatever, what it is, how do you interrogate that? And that's a little bit of what we're doing with this One Life series. We're saying, what do we think about this? How do we understand it? How do we unpack it? So we want young people to be able to see that and to grow that fire within them that then serves their communities and serves their church as well. So that's a little bit of our reason for partnering with the One Life, the One Life series. But I'd say it's also because we just like you a lot too. So it's been a good thing. I've attended all 5, and they've been very, very good and informative, and have challenged my thinking. And I've learned something new in each one. So I very much appreciate that. So your second question, Joel, was how is the Micah Centre emblematic of King's mission, or something similar to that? I really see the Micah Centre, and Jonathan maybe will perk up here, I don't know, but I really see the Micah Centre as the mission lived out. In many ways, it's joining that thoughtful thinking about what does it mean to be a servant in this world, and how do we do that well, and how do we understand what we're doing so that we don't cause more harm? How do we also engage in a way that then helps build a more just, humane, sustainable world? And that's really, how do we practice this? So we have a justice fellowship or a justice semester in which students can engage together in a cohort and learn and engage and be in some of these communities and learn what it means to be, to serve the global poor. So learning and serving together, and in a way that is more than a practice. I think it's something that we have to engage with deeply, and it becomes a part of ourselves. So Jonathan began as program director for the Micah Centre in the Christmas of 2017. He just told the group 2018, but he's forgetting it was 2017. So he's been around a little bit longer. But he has participated in the Micah Centre as a student intern with in Haiti, and then with MCC and World Renew. Jonathan is a graduate of with his master's from Regent College in Vancouver. He's been actively engaged in urban gardens and small farms and community development. And he spent, before Kings, he spent more than 10 years working with men and women leaving prison and resettling in Edmonton. In addition to the Micah Centre, he also teaches in our theology program, and something that's not on his bio that you can't find out from the King's website is that he also co-leads our Visual Arts Council. And so that is a neat thing, and he can talk about that if he wants to, but it's basically looking at all of the wonderful art that is infused in the King's campus. That has been gifts and other things from community artists, and ensures that they are displayed appropriately and brings in artists to display their art around King's campus too. So that's something you won't find on his bio, but he's got depth is what I'm trying to say. So without further ado, Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks for your kind words. And can everybody hear me? Can I get a wave too, just to make sure? Yeah, okay. Every once in a while over the last 20 minutes, my screen has told me my internet connection is unstable. So hopefully that doesn't happen as I'm presenting, but glad it's just my internet connection that's unstable. It's nice to see some familiar faces, and thank you so much, Rachel, for that opening. That was really beautiful and articulate, and I think did a great job of articulating what a Christian vision of justice is, rooted in worship. And John Bell is a great resource to articulate that. You did a really great job of bringing that out for us all. So thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, so just bear with me as I do that, so that you can look at something besides me as I share. So let me just get that set up. Let's see. Can you see that? Yeah? Okay, great, wonderful. And so, pandemic, poverty, and prophetic justice. One of the things with these sessions is that you have to choose a topic much earlier than you begin preparing them. And so Wilma and I had an email conversation back and forth several months ago, and talked about what it might be worthwhile reflecting on and discussing. And this is sort of a topic and a theme that we came up with. But as I started working on it, I thought, maybe it might be better or maybe it might be more appropriate to reflect on sort of the first and the last of those 3 P's in that phrase, pandemic and prophetic justice. And so what I want to reflect on this evening is one question: what has been exposed by this pandemic? We've heard that word a lot, exposure, usually in reference to our fear of exposure to the coronavirus. But I wonder if we can also ask what else has been exposed by the pandemic. So we'll reflect a little on that, and we'll do that in the context of the biblical tradition of prophetic justice. What does it mean to be people carrying on the tradition of prophetic justice, of biblical justice, in a world where some of these things have been exposed over the last year and more? And so that's what I'm hoping to do this evening. So first, a little bit more about myself. Who am I and what story do I bring to this session? So my journey to justice, maybe. I spent just over 10 years in Vancouver and then Edmonton, working with folks leaving prison, living in homelessness, and struggling with addiction. And a good number of those folks were from communities that historically have been pushed to the edges of our society. So Indigenous communities, newcomers to Canada, folks who for one reason or another haven't had access to a high school education or a caring community. It's their stories. Those are disproportionately the folks that end up in Canada's prison system. And so it's that community that I really encountered in that work. And so it's their stories that have shaped my reading of the Bible and my practice of faith. And it's their stories that have shaped my vision of justice. I now work at the Micah Centre, King's Center for Justice and Anti-Poverty Education and Awareness and Equipping for our students and for the wider community. And we get our mandate from Micah 6 verse 8, to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. And we help students think about what that means in a world of global hunger, poverty, and injustice. And through that work, I've come to know friends from around the world. I count as friends now folks from Honduras and from Bangladesh and from Kenya from some of that work that I've done. And the top left of that sort of photo montage is a Micah Centre trip led by Roy Birkenbosch to Bangladesh, where they met with women's cooperatives who are working to empower their communities to address poverty. And so it's their stories too, some of these friends from around the world who further deepened my commitment to justice, but also to a Christian faith that sort of takes shape in love for and solidarity with our neighbors locally and our neighbors around the world. So let's begin with a little exercise in memory. Think back to the beginning of the pandemic. A little after the rush for toilet paper, and a little before we started realizing that our summer camping plans and our September school plans, and really any plans at all, were going to be dramatically changed. And that time, sort of between toilet paper and Lysol wipe scarcity and summer trip cancellations, one phrase we heard a lot was, "We're all in this together." Do you remember that? We're all in this together. That image on the screen is an image from a sign campaign in Toronto that a local artist put together at the beginning of the pandemic. We're all in this together. And we meant by that phrase, I think, that the COVID-19 virus itself could hamper any body, right? No matter your area code or your skin color or your tax bracket, the virus itself didn't care. But early statistics soon told us another story that said that, in fact, maybe we weren't all in this together. Black and Latino and Latina and newcomer communities across North America tested positive and were hospitalized at disproportionately higher rates. Not because of any genetic predisposition, but just because a higher percentage of folks in those communities worked frontline. They had public-facing jobs, they took public transportation, and they did not have access to paid sick leave. And so they were exposed more often. And now here we are towards, whatever we call this. I was just about to call it the end of the pandemic, but that's probably not the right phrase. On this end of the pandemic, and white North Americans are eagerly scheduling our vaccinations. My vaccine appointment is tomorrow. And all the while, frontline health workers in places like Honduras and Indonesia and the Congo are still waiting for theirs. I think both locally and globally, maybe we're not all in this together. As Ida Mutoigo from World Renew put it early on, we may be weathering the same storm, but we're in very different boats. Like we said earlier, we often talk during this pandemic about exposure. We fear being exposed to the virus, and we fear exposing others. There's another type of exposure I think that's worth talking about. The pandemic has exposed or highlighted or put into stark contrast things in our communities and in our world that have sort of always been there, but that haven't been exposed in the way that they have over the last year. Poor benefits and low pay for people working at our grocery stores, or health inequities around the world. The way more recently that patent law that's connected to vaccine patents helps some and not others. The way that communities of color feel the sharp edges of our world much more than others. This pandemic has exposed much about our world. So tonight, I'd like to take a look at a few of those things sort of squarely in the face and then ask, how are we as churches and as Jesus' disciples to think about these things? And I'm hoping instead of telling you sort of what I think or what you should think, I want to put forward maybe a model for thinking about these things together that we can hopefully take with us from tonight. And that model is the justice tradition of the biblical prophets. So a little map of where we're going tonight. So a brief introduction to biblical justice and maybe some sort of contrast to other definitions of justice. So what do we mean by justice? What is it? Why maybe do we not hear about it in relation to the Bible or Christian discipleship in some communities and we do in others? Why does it matter? And then a look at two fault lines, one global and one local, two things that have been exposed by the pandemic. And to do that, we'll look at the global vaccine rollout and the opioid crisis more locally. And as we look at those things, those fault lines, I want to ask, how would a lens of prophetic justice shape how we think about those things? What difference might that make for the way that we think about those things? And then I'll end with a brief sort of some takeaway lessons on justice that we can put in our back pockets as we leave for tonight. So, those who love God love what God loves. And God, we're told in the biblical tradition, loves justice. But what does that mean? What is justice? I quoted here Isaiah 61, but I could have quoted Psalm 37, for the Lord loves justice. Or Psalm 33, the Lord loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the steadfast love of the Lord. When you hear that word, justice, what images come to mind? What phrases, what stories, what films, what comes to mind when you think of justice? Just think about that on your own for a second. And maybe ask too, what images or stories or phrases do you think come to mind for your neighbors who maybe are not part of faith communities? What comes to mind when we think of justice? I think a host of images come to mind. It's one of those, in some ways, the word justice, sort of this vessel that gets filled with all sorts of things, depending who and where we are and what our story is. Maybe Lady Justice is the phrase that comes to mind, right? Blind Lady Justice with a sword in one hand and the scales of justice on the other. A sword and a weigh scale. Or maybe law courts and police officers. I used to work, like was mentioned, with folks leaving the prison system, and that world, sort of the justice system, I think that's what a lot of our neighbors associate with the word justice. The courts, the police, lawyers, judges, that sort of thing. More recently, last summer in particular, the word justice became connected to the protest movement on behalf of Black lives and communities of color. So maybe that's what comes to mind. Do we mean a fair sharing of goods? Do we mean punishment? Like when a family of a victim, a murder victim, cries on the courthouse steps, justice was not served today. Do we mean adherence to law? Like what do we mean by that phrase justice? I think we understand biblical justice best when we see it in the context of the big biblical story. So let's try to do that for a little while this evening, a little whirlwind tour of the biblical story of justice. So God's intention for the whole creation was to experience shalom, right relationship between us and our Creator, between the rest of creation. and with our fellow image bearers. Right relationships, shalom, a world of flourishing. Everything is as it should be. Made in God's image, human beings are given responsibility to sort of preside over the unfolding of creation and history, to use their vast powers of knowledge and will and creativity to enable the various dimensions of creation to flourish. A world of right relationships. As one author puts it, the God-given powers of humanity were to be bent toward loving service of the other. Bent towards loving service of the other, which is what Paul sort of repeats again in his letter to the Christians in Galatia. That freedom, that power is meant to be towards serving others. But the second act of the divine drama announces that God's good creation has been marred by sin. As a result of evil in us and in the world, the shalom and flourishing which God intended for the creation has not come about. And we don't have to look far to see the devastating effects of that brokenness. All our relationships have been spoiled. Rebellious against God, we become alienated from and hostile to each other, and indifferent to the goodness of creation, which we then plundered greedily. In the Genesis story, Genesis 4 through 11 narrates this sort of ever-widening circle of violence and disorder that characterizes life east of Eden, outside of Eden. But from among these post-Babel, post-Genesis 11 nations, God chooses to covenant with Abraham and Sarah, and through Abraham and Sarah, to form a people who will be a model community of shalom, to whom all nations will be attracted. So in Genesis 18, Yahweh God says, "For I have chosen Abraham so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, by doing what is church and the educational." Well, I see that my internet connection was unstable, so hopefully you're good. Okay, thanks, Melanie. So we read in Genesis 18, "For I have chosen Abraham that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just." And I, as a product of the Christian school, the Christian Reformed connected Christian schools and the Christian Reformed Church, I heard a lot about that word, covenant. And it was probably connected to the practice of justice in my teaching, but like Joel, I didn't catch it the first several times, and it was sort of a revelation to me later on in my education when I thought, oh, like deep, very at the sort of close to the beginning of the covenant story with Abraham is this language of walking around as right and just people. At the heart of the covenantal relationship are the idea of God's justice and righteousness. They define who God is, what God seeks, how God acts, and they define how the people of God are to act towards one another and in their actions in the world. So God's justice, therefore, is relational, deeply relational, but not just in the sense of personal relationships, but also in the sense of our social relationships, political and economic realities, as these get expressed in social and societal structures and systems. For the Christian committed to justice, it's all about just relationships. And we think about whether it's our economic connections with each other or our political life, it's about whether that relational world is a just one. This image by the artist J. Swanson, this is his image of Psalm 85, which we quoted actually in our liturgy earlier this evening. And that you see all the sort of relationships that can encompass justice. Economic relationships, family relationships, relationships with the creation. Justice is a relational reality. God's justice is directed at restoring humans and the whole creation in terms of all of the complexity of relationships. setting right again all those things that have been disrupted by sin. So a person or a law or an action is considered to be just, not according to some abstract principle of justice, which is sort of how it's articulated in the Canadian Constitution and in the American Bill of Rights and a whole host of other documents. But it's not according to some abstract principle of justice, but in terms of how it contributes to the restoration of shalom in the relationships within the community, with the community and the world, and with the creation itself. So we can think of something being just simply because it births or sustains shalom within the community. That's what doing justice is. The language of justice and righteousness is so prominent throughout the Bible that one biblical scholar, Gerhard von Rad, he concluded that there's absolutely no concept in the Old Testament with so central a significance for all of the relationships as that of tzedekah, or justice or righteousness. It's the standard not only for humanity's relationship to God, but also to other creatures, including other humans, and even right down to animals and the natural world. It embraces all of life, he says. That term that he uses is one of two words throughout the Hebrew Bible that are really important for this conversation, and that's mishpat and tzedekah. So when I teach Intro to the Bible to first-year students, I always tell them this is the two Hebrew words that they can sort of take with them and pull out at parties or something like that to impress their friends. Mishpat and tzedekah. So tzedekah is a Hebrew word that simply means rightness with respect to a relationship. Rightness with respect to a relationship. Something is right. It's tzedek. While mishpat refers to decisions and actions undertaken to fix relationships that are not right. So when you're doing mishpat, which usually gets translated justice in our English Bibles, you're doing that which restores things to rightness. It's to confront the unjust, to intervene on behalf of the oppressed, and to render judgment in their favor. Those terms are both deeply relational, right? It's about restoring things, restoring relationships to rightness, and they're both restorative. I was recently speaking at a local church here in Edmonton about some of these sort of themes, and I was asked, but do you think the church should be known as a church of justice or a church of mercy? And I said, well, I think that's the wrong question, because to do mercy is to restore, it's one means to restoring relationship, to restoring things to rightness. And so that sort of tension between grace or mercy and justice that we sometimes are asked to confront, I think is sort of a false question, because it's all about restoring relationships that are broken. The relationship of these three terms, so shalom, mishpat or justice, and tzedekah, righteousness, is really beautifully captured in Isaiah 32. Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness abide in the fruitful field. And the effect of righteousness will be shalom. And the result of righteousness, tzedekah, quietness and trust forever. What a beautiful articulation of shalom. The active quality of God's justice is captured well in Psalm 146, where we read that God executes justice for the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets the prisoners free, opens the eyes of the blind, and lifts up those who are bowed down. It's pretty profound sort of articulation of the work of justice, to the point that in many sort of political dictatorships where there are a good number of political enemies in prison, and historically, they actually edited some of those phrases out of those translations when they would give prisoners Bibles. Because it's pretty dangerous to let prisoners know that the Lord sets the prisoners free, right? That can get you into trouble. God's justice for the poor has a counterpart in that God is against the wicked, the unjust, the corrupt, those who mistreat others. The Exodus is sort of the paradigm of that sort of story. In that sense, justice is all about deliverance or liberation. It's a healing and a dismantling of these gross social barriers of the disadvantaged. People in distress are to be empowered at that very point where their participation in the community has been undercut. At that very point where their participation in the community has been undercut. So for the prophets, that means the unemployed are given work, and the lame dance, and the blind see, and the widows are provided for in Isaiah 35. And the eunuch is given many children, and the hungry are given food. Think about all those laws of empowering the poor to glean extra food at the edges of the field, right? And the landless are given land. So in that place where people are denied full participation in the community and denied the opportunity to be most fully themselves, it's right there where the God of justice intervenes. Recall how this is instituted in the Jubilee practices described in Leviticus 25, right? The restoration of debts that are keeping people from being who God intended them to be. Restoring land, restoring children that were maybe sold in debt slavery to wealthier people in the community. People are restored to what they've lost. So it makes justice really specific. The prophets in the book of Exodus and elsewhere, they think long and hard about what this actually means in the life of their community in really sort of, specific ways. So what I call prophetic justice is just the way that the prophets so clearly and resolutely, sort of clear-eyed and full-throated, articulate this vision of justice. They hold their neighbors to account. They call on kings to enact justice. One psalm I like to read with students here at King's when we are visiting poor communities in central Mexico, we read Psalm 72. And we often go in February because that's our reading week here at King's, and it's cold here and it's warm in central Mexico. And often, 4 years ago, the presidential inauguration had just happened, right? This big sort of fancy ceremony where the new president is installed into office. And at those ceremonies, they read poems and they pray and they, all sorts of ritual and practice that sort of surrounds it. And Psalm 72 in the biblical Psalms is sort of a psalm that was read in a context like that in Israel. And the amazing thing about Psalm 72 is that at one point it says, it sort of praises the would-be king for the way that they treat the poor and the oppressed and those who are hungry. And then it says, blessed is the blood of the poor in the sight of the king. Blessed is the blood of the poor in the sight of the king. And I always, then we talk as a group with the students, what difference would it make if those in power, either here when we're in central Mexico or at home, saw the blood of the poor as precious? Like what a transformative potential that has. So these prophets call out wealthy men and women for ignoring justice. They call out those in power. And so when we practice this justice, one way to think about it is just radical love. Justice as radical love. So that word radical is connected to the word for root, right? Like a radish, root vegetable. And so that's sort of what I like to think of as justice, is love that gets to the root of why people aren't flourishing the way God intends, and sort of addresses things at the root. And so that's in contrast, the practice of justice then, in contrast to something like charity or even development, which both are good things, but they're different. And so one common way to think about this is the fishing metaphor, right? So if you teach a woman, if you give a woman a fish, she'll eat for a day, right? So that's charity. When folks are sort of in immediate need and they need something to sort of live another day, we give them what they need, whether that's housing after a hurricane or whatever it is. If you teach a woman to fish, she'll eat for a lifetime. And that's much of what World Renew does. Many of you are familiar with their work, is equipping people to address the poverty in their communities in ways that they are empowered to do through teaching and resourcing and that sort of thing. But the problem is sometimes a wealthy person down the road actually owns the pond, and it doesn't matter how good of a fisher person the woman is, if she can't get at the pond because she's being denied access to the pond, then we need to get her towards the pond, or we need to empower her to get herself access to the pond. And that's justice, is addressing matters of power and inequities and those things that are stopping people from being able to express who they are as God intended them to be. There's a great example of that from the Gospel of Luke and of Mark, where in Luke 21 is where it is in Luke, I think maybe Mark 12, in the Gospel of Mark, where the story of the widow's offering or the widow's mite. And often, so that's often a story that gets brought out when at the end of the year, maybe in some church communities, when they're short on church budget and you want to encourage generosity. And so maybe you preach on the widow's offering. You remember the story of the widow who gives out of her poverty, she gives to the temple. And yeah, that's often how we think of that, that story. And I think often even that phrase, the widow's mite or the widow's offering, sort of harkens to ideas of generosity. But just before that story, we read Jesus say this. He says, while the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. And then it goes on to tell the story of the widow's offering. And the connection there, I think what Luke is trying to do, particularly given some of the other things that Luke says about God's love for the poor in his gospel, is he's chastising these religious leaders who've created a system in which it's necessary for this poor widow to give out of the little she has to this system so that they can live in comfort and ease. So it's as much, and that's not to take away the story of the widow's generosity. I think that is very much a part of it, but it's also chastising the injustice that's perpetuated by the religious leaders in that community. So justice as radical love is about asking a couple of key questions. It's about, where do we see injustice? So what relationships are disordered, broken, disrupted? What's stopping people from flourishing? And it's about, how do we do justice? How can we restore those relationships? How can we mend what is broken? Isaiah 58 is a great example of that sort of movement, where the prophet says to the people of Israel, you are called not to fancy religious ceremony to make things right with God. You are called to the practice of justice. And how do you do that? The prophet Isaiah says, loose the chains of injustice. So sometimes I like thinking about that as sort of a more charitable response, like loose those chains. And he says, untie the cords of the yoke, right? So development, make it a little easier for people to loose those chains and live the lives that God intended for them. But then the prophet says, set the oppressed free and break every yoke. So don't just stop at loosing the chains or untying the cords, break every yoke, which is about dismantling those systems that are really stopping people from flourishing. That's Isaiah 58. And so one sort of way to think about, are we sort of living and thinking in line with the biblical prophets, is just asking, how does this or that decision, how does this or that community, how does this or that initiative affect the least of these? The poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger are sort of the four that the prophets use a lot. But we can think of what that equivalence would be in our communities in Canada or in BC. How does this affect, how do we see the world from below? So echoes, moving to the New Testament, echoes of Psalm 146 are heard in Mary's Magnificat in Luke 1. And more than that, her son Jesus embodies justice throughout his life. In Luke 4, he applies Isaiah 61 that we quoted earlier to himself. And in Matthew 11, he points to his deeds as a fulfillment of Isaiah's vision of the restoration of Shalom. In his ministry, Jesus restored the outcast, the blind, the leper, the possessed. He was the righteous king who brings God's justice, God's upside down kingdom. His was a life lived and a death died for the sake of restoring us to right relationship, TSEDEKAH, with God, neighbor, and the creation. So simply put, as the Apostle Paul puts it, Jesus is God's justice in the flesh. His followers are to imitate his example, pursuing justice by building signposts of the kingdom, motivated not by ideology, but by a desire to be like Jesus. So that's the whirlwind tour of the biblical story of justice, the big biblical story of justice. Before we move on from that, we'll just wait. Hold on. One thing that people ask sometimes when at the Micah Centre we reflect on some of these things is if justice is so central to the biblical story and so sort of integral to discipleship, then why don't we hear more about it? So 3 quick answers or things to think about on that. One of them is sort of a matter of translation. So those 2 words, MISHPAT and TSEDEKAH, justice and righteousness, when they make their way to the New Testament through various sort of translations in the early church, which is the New Testament is written in Greek. And so the word that's sort of used to describe both those things together is this Greek word dikaiosune. And in English Bibles, that word is translated as righteousness. But interestingly, in other languages, it's actually translated as justice. So in Spanish, it's justicia. And so in the Beatitudes, we read, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. But Spanish Christians read, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justicia. And that little translation, I think, does a lot of work, actually, sort of interestingly. Because when I think of the word righteousness, we sort of think about like personal piety, or maybe someone who some self-righteousness, right? Which has pretty negative connotations. But really what's meant by that, when we see the word righteousness in our New Testaments, what's sort of being articulated there is that desire to see the world mended and injustice dismantled so that people can live in right relationship. That's what that word is sort of hoping to get at. And so those who seek first the kingdom and its righteousness, or in Spanish, it's justicia, that's sort of what it's getting at, which I like to, sometimes in the margins of my Bible, I just write justice beside it, just as a reminder that that's what it's getting at there. It's also sort of a matter of the cross, how we understand what happens on the cross. And this is a big nut to crack that we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but just sort of to think about, what do we think happens when Jesus dies on the cross, right? The Apostle Paul says we preach nothing but Christ and Christ crucified. And if the cross is simply about just the forgiveness of our sins, or the crucified Jesus simply as a substitution for our sins, though it is that, but if it's nothing more, well, then who needs justice, right? It's just about preaching the grace of the cross. But the New Testament uses all sorts of images for what happens on the cross. And a key one, especially in the book of Colossians, is the defeat of the powers of death and destruction, right? The principalities and powers. The defeat of death and the powers of death. That's what happens in Jesus' cross and resurrection. And it's also described as a sort of model for our lives of cross-shaped following. Jesus was killed for a life of covenant faithfulness that saw lives and relationships restored in ways that sort of upset the status quo and disrupted the way things are. And God affirms that life by raising Jesus from the dead. And so all of those things are also what we are preaching when we preach Christ crucified. And the last thing I have there is just that justice is hard. You know, it asks something of us. We'll talk about that in a bit when we try to get a bit more specific, but justice is not easy. I think justice is joyful and rewarding and a key part of what we're called to, but it's not easy. And so maybe one of the reasons it doesn't come up as much is because it really asks something of us, and that can be hard, and it's okay to admit that too. So there's the whirlwind tour, and now let's talk about what this looks like. So it's one thing to say what justice is, but what does justice look like? Part of what it means to do justice, inspired by the biblical prophets, is to really look at the world. I saw something recently from the hip hop artist and Christian, and sort of, I think, a pretty profound theologian in his own way. His name is Shad. And he was asked recently how he still sees the world as a good place, given all the terrible things that have happened in the past year. And he said, you know, and I know that he's a person of faith. He didn't articulate this in this answer, but Shad said, you know, I don't think it's about seeing the world as a good place. I think it's about being willing to look at the world's suffering squarely in the face. And when he said, when I do that, I tend to see way more goodness than I see otherwise. There's something about being willing to sort of engage with the world as it is that opens us up to its suffering, but also opens us up to its beauty and its goodness. Kind of like that Leonard Cohen line, the cracks are how the light gets in. So let's look at two things that have been exposed by the pandemic and ask what justice might look like as we think about these things in line of the biblical prophets. And I want to say first off that I'm not sort of introducing these things as any sort of expert, but more just, to sort of think together about what a prophetic justice angle might look like. So the first is the global vaccine rollout. Sorry if you can't see those. I can share this PowerPoint later if you want to sort of take a look at some of these slides more closely or closer up if that font is small. But so what's being exposed? So tomorrow I'm scheduled to get my first vaccination, and many of you maybe have already got yours. And I think that's something to celebrate, obviously. But part of a commitment to justice is seeing beyond ourselves to our neighbors, globally and locally, and saying what's good for us can hopefully be good for them as well. And in this case, what is good for us has not been available and will not be available for a good many. So as of mid-April, wealthy countries had secured more than 87% of the global vaccine supply in the world, 87%. While 1 in 4 had received at least one dose in many of those countries, in most very poor countries, so the United Nations has a sort of rubric for categorizing different countries according to their socioeconomic well-being, and those labeled least developed, which I don't love that phrase, but those countries, that figure is about 1 in 500. So 1 in 4 in wealthier countries, 1 in 500. I was just on the phone with a friend of mine in Honduras, and he was telling me about his sister-in-law who works the front lines in a hospital in sort of an equivalent of a emergency room in Tegucigalpa. So a very busy city, a very densely populated city. And she was still awaiting her vaccine. And I felt this sort of sense of, that was a hard conversation to have, knowing that I was getting my vaccine soon, as somebody who can sort of distance myself from sort of social interaction in a lot of ways relatively easily because of my work and my family's privilege. This has meant that while economies in the EU and the USA start to come back, there's many in the global south that are, in fact, their economies are getting worse. With total poverty numbers globally are rising for the first time basically in a generation. They're getting higher. So Canada is still weighing support for vaccine patent waivers after President Biden's decision to do just that in the United States. And no country has committed to what's called tech transfer. So it's one thing, the first thing that has to sort of be waived in order to create or sort of produce vaccines in places outside of where there's a patent to do so is a patent waiver in a place like India, maybe, that might have the capacity. But then they also need tech transfer, so sort of sharing of knowledge and technology in order to ramp that up. And nobody's committed to do that yet. So that's sort of what's happening. It's a hard thing to think about. So what questions would those of us in line with the biblical prophets ask? Well, I think the first thing we would say is not a question, but just the simple conviction that this is not right. I think it's always tempting when we're sort of part of the world and taking in news media to say, well, that's just sort of how the world works. Like, that's just the way it is, as tough as it is. But I think the prophets sort of inspire us, hopefully, and that's as much an indictment on me as anybody, to say that's just sort of the way it is. But I think the biblical prophets say, no, that might be the way it is, but it's not the way that things have to be. This is not right. And just simply saying that, I think, prompts us to start imagining how things could be. A friend of mine who teaches chemistry here at King's, she said, you know, what would happen? She sort of studies the pharmaceutical industry. And she said, what would happen if the Prime Minister's office declared that they were going to bring in all of the vaccines that they had negotiated for the month of June, but then they were going to give half of them to India or Brazil or Honduras, and which would mean that Canadians would have to wait longer, right, for their vaccines. What sort of storm would that create if the Prime Minister's office did that? So the next question that I think the biblical prophets prompt us to ask is, who's suffering? Whose suffering are we listening to? Paul Farmer, who's a devout Catholic and a really inspiring international public health activist, he talks about how he was inspired to Peru, both out of a commitment. So Paul Farmer is committed to his ministry among the poor, both out of a sort of theological commitment towards the preferential option for the poor, is how he talks about it. But it's also, he says, out of a response to the reality that diseases make a preferential option for the poor. Diseases make a preferential sort of bias towards the poor and viruses and sickness. And by that, he means that there's a simple reality that diseases and viruses affect poor communities much more, whether it's malaria or COVID or HIV/AIDS or TB or hepatitis B. Marginal communities are almost always affected more often and more deeply. If we believe all are created as image bearers of God, and that God is so especially fond of us. That's how the Jesuit priest Gregory Boyle talks about God's love for us. God is so especially fond of us. And if that's true, and if that's true of everybody, then what does that imply about the way that those who suffer from preventable diseases around the world, about their suffering and the sort of global communities in action towards it? They're hard. Those are hard conversations. I think the next sort of question is, what broken and disordered relationships are being exposed? So in this case, is it international trade agreements that are involved? There's global politics. There's these sort of huge companies that are involved, and it all sort of seems beyond us. This is sort of, like globalization at its biggest. And then the question is, so who holds power in those relationships? The biblical prophets always held power to account. Kurt Verbeek, who some of you may know, runs Association for a More Just Society in Honduras. He says, if you're doing justice, you're going to make somebody mad. And if you're not making people mad, you're probably not doing justice. That's his definition in Honduras. And I don't know if that's always true, but I think it's not a terrible rule of thumb to say holding power to account is part of what justice is. Recently, the CEO of the Swiss pharmaceutical company Novartis said, you just can't expect, this is a quote, you just can't expect for-profit organizations to research on a large scale prevention of disease in the global south. If you want to establish a system where companies systematically invest in that kind of thing, you just need a different system. So he just sort of said it, said what a lot of us sort of feel may be true. But I also, then we asked, so who holds power? Well, so there are some big power brokers in this whole sort of nexus of things to sort of think about. And I'm not an expert in how to sort of untangle all of that. But I think it's also worth remembering that whether it was the HIV/AIDS crisis in the late 1990s and early 2000s, or in other, maybe it was global debt relief in the late 1990s and early 2000s, communities of faith were at the forefront of demanding that governments address things. So when it was HIV/AIDS medicines that were really highly priced and basically unaffordable in most of sub-Saharan Africa, it was Christians who pushed their governments to say, we need to make these in sort of generic form. We need to waive these patents so that people can live. This is a matter of life or death. And you might remember Bono from U2 was really key to that. But there were others, he was sort of riding the crest of Christian faith communities around the world who were voicing that concern. The next question that we ask, I think prompted by the prophets, is what are some available actions? Like what can we do? And what can be done, maybe if it's not us, by others. Here, I think it's worth saying here that very often the call to justice is a call to engaging the powers of government and business who have a lot of power, but it doesn't always have to be that way, right? So sometimes it should be just maybe about organizing a community art project that heightens awareness, or a gathering of folks who are suffering and folks who maybe can provide care, or a public statement from the churches, which was something that happened often. I think it happens actually more in Vancouver. When I lived there, it happened, there was sort of cross-denominational solidarity around some key things like housing. Doesn't happen as much here in Edmonton, but I think that holds maybe more weight than we might think. Or maybe it's just a fundraiser. But it's just a question of asking, what can we do? Is there some way to transform this into action through prayer? And prayer is sort of one of those key actions that I think we can always undertake. And then the other thing to sort of ask is sort of connected to that, is just what opportunities for the church, right? As faith communities. Maybe it's in our worship, maybe it's in our gathering outside of Sunday morning, but how as a church can we act? Not just as individuals sort of on their own, but as faith communities, as gathered communities. All right, so that's sort of some of what I think the biblical prophets sort of prompt us to ask in relation to these big sort of intimidating things like the global vaccine rollout. And the question of, if all are made in God's image, what can we do in response? Another maybe more local issue, the opioid crisis. And thanks to Rachel actually for prompting me to think about this a little bit more since our conversation a few weeks ago, Rachel Brugge. Alberta opioid deaths continue to spiral, says that headline, with 228 in the first 2 months of 2021. In Vancouver and area, and BC, sorry, I think it's actually provincial number. Those numbers are 498 in the first 3 months of the year. In 2020, 1,716 people died of suspected drug overdoses in BC, and those numbers were similar in Alberta. Since 2016, in 2016, I think it was the BC public health minister pretty courageously said this is a public health emergency and declared it as such, and sort of led the way on that. And since then, though, 7,000 sons and daughters have died of opioid-related deaths. And those numbers are similar in Alberta, to the point that the public health minister or officer in BC declared it a parallel pandemic to the pandemic that we're struggling with now. And it's not something that is isolated to major centers like Edmonton or Vancouver, right? This is happening in Smithers and in Prince George and in Nelson and across BC and across Alberta, in small towns and large jurisdictions. And it's something to ask. When Rachel prompted me to think about this a few weeks ago, I thought of that line from Exodus, where God says of the suffering of his people Israel in Egypt, I have indeed heard the suffering of my people. It's God's hearing of suffering that sort of prompts that whole story to gain momentum. So are we hearing the suffering of our neighbors? Again, I think we ask the same questions. We start out by saying, this is not right. This is not right. This is something that is not the way it's supposed to be. And that's what sort of begins the commitment to the work of justice. But then it's about asking who's suffering and why maybe are we not listening to the suffering of these communities? What is it about those who are struggling with addiction that I know this might, and this is a tricky topic. There's lots of us with personal connections to this. I know that I have many through my work in the inner city. There's lots of names and faces connected to this issue. It's not just sort of an abstraction, and they suffer from loneliness and trauma and mental health concerns and a whole host of other things. So who's suffering? To whom are we listening? What broken and disordered relationships are being exposed? I don't know if any of you took the time to watch the Academy Awards. I did not, but there's a wonderful quote that came out of it from a Black filmmaker named Trayvon Free, who made a short film that won an Academy Award. And he said in his speech, the most despicable thing that anyone can do is to be indifferent to other people's pain. And I thought about that today, actually, as I was reading this really moving reflection by a former CBC journalist, Tara McGuire, who lost her son to an opioid overdose, and who talked about what it feels like to see all these sort of resources mobilized to address the coronavirus, as they should be, but that she's just had a heck of a time trying to get any sort of practical support for those who are struggling with opioid addiction. And that actually, if you want to look at that article, it's called "This Is What It Feels Like" by Tara McGuire. It's really worth reading. And asking some of those same questions: who holds power? Maybe in this context, do we hold some power to act? Right? Is there something we can do in our faith communities or our churches? Maybe we can talk at our city councils about safe drug supply or spaces for safe use. Maybe we can talk about how to make treatment more affordable and lend our voices that way. Maybe we can have open conversations in our churches about what that would look like in our families and neighborhoods. One of the things that Tara McGuire talks about in that article is just the deep shame connected to this issue. And so how do you be more open in conversations about it? With, openness of conversation and healing, that is the work of justice. It's not just about taking to the street in protest or letter writing to government officials. It's that work too, that sort of ordinary work of listening that's really important. And then again, what are some available actions? So those questions, I think, are a bit of a model for how we might be prompted by the biblical prophets to look at the world differently. And I think it has implications for a whole host of things that have been exposed by this pandemic. Housing and homelessness. What might it look like for the church to take the lead on that? For maybe a Christian apartment owner to tithe 1/10 of the rooms in her building to people who need affordable rent, subsidized rent. our care for our frontline workers, right? That's been something that's been talked about a lot, and I think rightly so. How do we, whether it's through living wage or benefits, how can we equip those folks to live the lives that God calls them to live in flourishing ways? And how can the church, again, take the lead on that? And then the matter of racial justice. Very much a reckoning over the last year, and rightly so. Will Van Aragon, I know, talked with you about Indigenous settler reconciliation and the land back movement. You know, having those hard conversations, I think in the light of what we saw earlier about what biblical justice is, I think can give us space to have some of those really hard conversations, but really important ones. So I'm going to leave you with some sort of things to take in your back pocket. Maybe if you're asking, is what I'm doing seeking justice the way that the prophet Micah or the prophet Amos intended? Yeah, how do I know if I'm seeking justice, and what are some things that sort of shape justice seekers? Here's some things that maybe we can think about together. The first is, I think justice seekers are willing to say this is not right. That simple statement to say against the status quo, this is not right. This is not the way it's supposed to be. Even if you don't have all the answers. And I'm assuming none of us have all the answers to addressing global vaccine rollout and injustices connected to it. But to at the very least say, this is not right. This is not the way it's supposed to be, is I think something that justice seekers can say. Another mark of justice seekers, I think, is that they have courageous imaginations. They're willing to think outside the box. Our imaginations as Christians are shaped by the advent of God's kingdom in Jesus and the small visions of that kingdom that we encounter in our lives. Justice seekers are vulnerable enough to talk about power, and that's a hard one. I think a lot of Christian Reformed churches have been prompted maybe by the movement for racial justice over the last year and a half. That's really gained momentum. It's been there for a long time, but gained momentum and a platform that maybe it hadn't had before. Can we talk about our power? How can we make space for others' power? How can we give away power? How can we share power? Andy Crouch, in his great little book on power, talks about the need for vulnerability as we practice power. And so how do we go about doing that? As for those of us with power, how can we be allies? And for those of us without power, we can ask, why isn't our voice being heard? What community, what history is edging us aside? And what's stopping us from living the life of shalom that God intends for us? Those are really hard questions to ask, but I think the church is sort of uniquely equipped at its best, and I know we're not always at our best, but at its best to answer those questions. Justice seekers love what God loves, which I think at its heart is the human being fully alive. That's what justice is all about, making space for the human being fully alive. Justice seekers enact parables of the kingdom. This is a phrase from the theologian Karl Barth, but I like it because it sort of hints towards that idea that we don't need to have all the answers. We just need to sort of here and there sometimes enact a parable of the kingdom, a sort of small vision of the kingdom. Justice seekers strive to do all things with love. I think one unique contribution of the Christian community is in this sort of polarized moment where the work of justice sort of gets wrapped up in sort of polarized cultural debates, that we can try to do our work of justice with love. As one, Sharon Wilson puts it this way, she says, do all things with love and be dang fierce about it. And it's written on my wall. And the last one is just that justice seekers practice joy. Justice seekers practice joy. I think that's something not always associated with the work of justice, but It should be. I think Christian justice advocates, where does our joy come from? It comes from intentional practice, I think, like practicing gratitude so that we can see things that we should be joyful about when they arise. It comes from a deep-seated hope of a new kingdom. And I also think we practice joy because justice work is fun. You encounter great people, you see human beings flourish. You can build community across difference. It's really wonderful. There's this great line from a Jack Gilbert poem called "The Brief for the Defense," where he says, "We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil." And so I'll leave you with a quote from Wendell Berry. "The work of justice can be hard and it can be complicated, and we never have all the answers. I certainly don't. So I always think about this line in relation to that. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work, and that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings." Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was very, very great. And I see people applauding. It's again, this whole Zoom thing doesn't make for the best reader response and interaction, but I just really want to be grateful. And we're gonna have a short time for some questions here. And I just want to say for myself, there's a couple of nuggets that I took out, and one of them was just your emphasis on that kind of Spanish translation of the New Testament word for righteousness, justice, just what that even does to the Beatitude, where that I just think that's just a nugget to walk away with. And but I was thinking just kind of in general, your talk really made me think about how right thinking leads to right acting, right? Orthodoxy leads to orthopraxis, right? So how that I'm part of a denomination, the Christian Reformed Church, that maybe a few years ago, heard, about this whole Belhar confession thing, and we absorbed it in some ways, but there was some resistance to this phrase, that God is in a special way the God of the poor. But you reminded us with, Psalm 72, how, how blessed is the blood of the poor in the sight of the king. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that dynamic, right? That how our prophetic voice speaks into our denomination, in particular, our culture, that we come from as Christians, to kind of influence it with this prophetic vision.
Yeah, I will. Someone just knocked at my door, I think, telling me that they're going to lock the door. So I'm just going to let them know, just to make sure I can get out of the building.
You take care. That is a priority. We want you to get home, and we appreciate, just to kind of fill some space here, we appreciate, Jonathan, that it is already 9:30 in Alberta, and understandable that they might be checking to make sure that you should be leaving work at some point. So hopefully you heard that. Is there a way that you can kind of follow up and give some sort of an answer to that? Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I think, I think the conversations around the Belhar were really interesting in that respect, because I think we do have a tradition in the Christian Reformed Church of thinking pretty deeply about justice and God's commitment to the poor, but then to hear in the words of Christians from the global South, right, that was articulated in South Africa, that in fact, actually God has sort of this preferential love for the poor. That's sort of unsettling for those of us who aren't in that sort of demographic. But I think the way that Gustavo Gutierrez puts it, he's the Peruvian theologian who sort of came up with the phrase God's preferential option for the poor in the 70s and 80s. And when he describes it, he talks about, he tells the story always of a mother welcoming two children home from school. And one has had a wonderful day and has had fun at recess and enjoyed their friends and comes home smiling. And the other child comes home with scrapes and bruises and sort of wounded by their day at school. Maybe it was friends or a bully or whatever it was. And for the And for the mother, she'll move towards that one who's been wounded and sort of embody her love for them both in a sort of unique and particular way to that child who's been hurt. And I think that's kind of what God's sort of, the way that the bell harp puts it, that sort of preferential bias towards or love for the poor, is that that embodied love towards those who've sort of felt the hard edges of our world in ways that maybe some of us haven't. And I think that I also just sort of think of spending some time with Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, or Amos, or the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Luke or Mark. It's hard to avoid actually that that conclusion, because Jesus articulates that in the Beatitudes in particular, but elsewhere too, in pretty sort of direct ways. So yeah, I think it was really interesting. And Rene Padilla, who is a Latin American theologian, he just passed away. Some of you may know Ruth Padilla de Borst, his daughter, who works for Resonate in Costa Rica. But Rene Padilla, if you read his biography that was written in Christianity Today when he passed away about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, it describes his attempt to sort of translate that idea, God's preferential option for the poor, for these sort of North American and Western European evangelicals who he was connected to through different circles. And he was invited to speak at an event. They were thinking, oh, this guy, he's an evangelical. He sort of speaks our language. We're on the same team. And he began by sort of laying out maybe some of the questions he has for some of the liberation theologians. But then he said to these North American and Western European theologians, until you start answering the questions of the poor, I'm going to direct the people in my church towards liberation theologians, because the things that you're talking about in your theology is not answering their questions. And he sort of beat that drum for the rest of his life as a theologian. So anyway.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm gonna just as a note, you can ask a question in the chat. I see that Wilma kind of asked a question similar to what I've just asked, but I want to turn things over to Rachel. Rachel's going to ask a question, and then if there's some questions from the chat, we'll pick those up as well.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. There's many things here to talk about and that I could ask you about, but I did want to ask about something that you said at the end about enacting parables of the kingdom. Could you give an example of that? What did you mean by that?
Yeah. Sorry, I was sort of feeling like I was short on time, so I moved through that quick. But I think sometimes when we feel called to the work of justice, there's this sense that we need all the answers before we can do anything. And there's also this sense that we need to address our work towards the sort of powers that be, whether that's government or multinational corporations or whatever. And we do, I think, need to direct some of our work in those directions, because they do hold a lot of power and shape our lives and the lives of the poor in pretty profound ways. But I think what Karl Barth meant is that we can, maybe it's through hosting a party in your neighborhood that sort of transgresses the sort of cultural and racial boundaries, where everybody's invited and sort of shares a common table. That would be a parable of the kingdom. Or a community garden, or maybe in a grade school classroom in a Christian school, where young kids maybe make space for a kid who's left out, or who sort of intentionally share their wealth as young kids, maybe through their allowances or whatever, and give it to an organization that's serving the poor. Like, I think there are ways of enacting justice that can be small and sort of a window into the bigger vision of the kingdom that doesn't necessarily require us to have all the answers, or to be willing to meet with our MP, though that's important sometimes, or to write a letter to Justin Trudeau or whatever it is. I think sometimes it can be smaller sort of visions of sort of windows into the big vision of the kingdom.
Maybe Jessica's got a question that's in the chat, and maybe we'll kind of end it there, just because I'm conscious of time, and you know, we do try to get people home. They're already home, but at a reasonable hour. But I'm just going to read her question. Your definition of prophetic justice read, clear-eyed and full-throated voicing. For those of us who struggle feeling full-throated and unable to voice our feelings around issues of justice, do you have any tips or suggestions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we all sort of start where we are. I think I just recently listened to an interview with the novelist Zadie Smith, really wonderful British novelist, Black woman, and she was talking about her experiences living in New York during the protests for racial justice last summer, and how she sort of felt this need to go into the street and be a part of them, but she also didn't feel comfortable doing that. And so for her, what she did was she wrote, and that was sort of the gift that she had to offer. And I think all of us sort of have to start where we are. And for those of us who can be more full-throated, we should be. But if we don't feel like that's our gifting, I think that's okay too. And I think of some of the biblical prophets themselves, you know, some of them were sort of prophets in the king's court. So they were right in the sort of heart of power, and they said what they said to the kings themselves. And that took some audacity and some courage to do that. But others were, you know, rural prophets whose voices were probably never heard by the king, at least in their lifetime. They lived in maybe the contemporary equivalent of like Nearlandia, like way outside of the sort of halls of power in a small community, and yet they sort of found ways to embody their commitment to God's kingdom in their unique ways. So I think there's all sorts of ways. Like Jeremiah bought a field when it was crazy to do that, as a symbol of his commitment to God's sort of commitment to Israel and to the land. And if nobody wrote that down, we would have never seen that. But I think that still is a testament to the power of that action. So I think there's all sorts of ways that we can start where we begin.
Thanks, Jonathan. I mean, I don't know really how to end this. In some ways, I want to say you really ticked me off, because that means you've been doing justice here, but you haven't. You've really, there's some things that are unsettling and should be unsettling for me and for us, and so I appreciate that. But I just want to thank you again for this really engaging way that you've handled this material and introduced or reintroduced it to some of us. And so thanks very much on behalf of One Life for your participation here, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks.
Many applauses from all around.
You know, actually, as I think, you know, to answer your question about where to start, if you're interested in resources, Nicholas Wolterstorff wrote a book with Kurt Verbeek, who is this guy from Honduras I mentioned. And in the back of that book, there's a guide in justice. And that's really excellent, actually. And that's like approachable, it's accessible. I think you can find it free online, Verbeek and Wolterstorff, Getting Started. And you could use it for young kids. You could use it for high school students. You could use it for a small group in a church. It's a really wonderful place to start.
Perfect, thanks. So can you just repeat the one sentence you said? We just lost it a bit
sorry.
of it. In the back of the book, there's a guide, something for
yeah,
justice.
Sorry, thanks. Wilma has it there. Yeah, so Chelsea has the link. The back of that book has a really awesome guide and some really good questions to sort of get you started.
Okay, thanks so much. And this is also, just kind of a nice segue into, you know, the work that Rachel does on behalf of One Life with respect to mercy and justice. And so I've got a question for her. In addition to the resources that, you know, that Jonathan's just shared, you know, how can folks, kind of continue to utilize One Life as a resource for mercy and justice in our churches, and kind of what's upcoming in this vein?
So we will meet together, if you're interested, next Monday night for a follow-up of this lecture. And I really liked that verse from Isaiah, Jonathan, that you pulled out, where it ends with, in quietness and trust. When we've done, that's the picture of shalom. And so I know that many of us justice seekers can feel tired and can feel lonely in our situations. But there's many ways that we can partner together and encourage each other and also feel inspired and nourished for the work that we do. And so part of the work that I do as the One Life Justice and Mercy Curator is not to work alone, but to find all the equippers locally, classically, and denominationally that are doing this work, so that we can place those opportunities for action before you, for your churches, and also continue to provide for you the biblical vision for justice, and so that we can walk humbly together and do it in a way that can be sustained for the long term.
Perfect. Thanks, Rachel. I think I'm going to turn it now back to you and to the other One Life curators, kind of for some closing exercises, if I can frame it that way.
There will be a feedback form going into the chat that you can fill out now. It will just take a couple of minutes if you would be willing to do that at some point before we close out this evening. And at this time, Ashley, I'd like to just talk briefly about our One Life vision and mission. And so our vision is that the BCCRCs become more and more vibrant, wholehearted communities of Christian worship, discipleship, and mission. And that our mission is to connect individuals, congregations, and the broader community to a curated curriculum of resources that bring coherence and depth, encourage theological reflection, leadership, and faith-filled practice, and encompasses all 5 callings: faith formation, global mission, mercy and justice, servant leadership, gospel proclamation, and worship. And we do these things by embodying our values, which is a prayerful dependence on the Trinity, hospitable space and hospitable pace, that we provide authentic and charitable conversations, holistic learning and community through action and reflection, timely theological reflection with a reformed accent, and covenantal relationships with classis and denomination. So, you know, we've bitten off a huge chunk here, but we love working together as a team and hope to partner with many people going forward, going into our 2nd year, starting in September again. And just to close out our evening together, I would like to come back to the idea of justice and worship. So there was a music group that came together this past year called the Porter's Gate. And Porter's Gate wrote many songs, 2 albums, songs of justice and songs of lament. And the closing prayer that we're going to do together is based on a prayer from the Common Book of Prayer and a song that Porter's Gate wrote called "We Will Not Make Peace with Oppression." And this is our thought and prayer going forward, that we will not make peace with oppression, and that we will continue to seek justice and peace and shalom for all. So please join our One Life team in a closing prayer. Almighty God, who created us in your image,
Grant us grace fearlessly to contend against evil,
and to make no peace with oppression.
And that we may reverently use our freedom. Help us to employ it in the maintenance of justice.
Among the nations, to the glory of your holy name.
Through Jesus Christ, our Lord,
who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit,
one God, now and forever. Amen.
Well, thanks so much, One Life team, for leading us through that. It brings us to a close to our time. I want to thank, you just heard from each of the members of the One Life team, and especially to you, Rachel, tonight. Thank you to the King's University President Melanie with us, Ashley for her work again behind the scenes, especially once more to Reverend Jonathan Nicolai DeKoning. And then just to look ahead, you're going to see on the screen as we close out, there's going to be a slide that shows the Deep Waters event that Rachel talked about on May 17. And you'll also see some Thursday night lectures that King's is offering over the next, I think, 4 or 5 weeks. And so again, on behalf of One Life, thanks to each one of you for being here. Enjoy the song as you fill out that questionnaire, if you would, as you listen to the song. It's a musical way for you to answer those questions. And essentially, we're glad that you join us. And until we meet again somewhere, the peace of Christ be with you all.